For decades, literally decades, we had one Freehub to rule them all. But time waits for no man or Freehub. So now we've got 3 different standards. We're going to take a look at the 3 standards that are out there and how to switch them on some different wheels. A Freehub body is a ratcheting body that sits in the hub, and that's what the cassette and cog slide onto, rather than say a screw-on cog or driver assembly. For mountain bike types, we've got 3 different versions. We've got the original, designed from the late 70s from Shimano. This is the Hyperglide. It's sometimes known as HG. It was a Shimano original, and it works for, let's see, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, and some non-Shimano 12-speed gear ranges. So it's really adaptable, and it's a standard that's still out there. It's known for having little spline and then lots of different space splines on there. You'll find it on lots and lots of bikes. So next in line, sort of in chronological order, we've got the XD driver. So SRAM introduced this, and you can see the difference on the kind of nose or sort of end size. So that's on the outside of the drive side of the hub. And it's much smaller there, and that's so that they could go down to a 10-tooth cog. So that sort of heralded the true first one-bar drivetrains. So that's the XD driver. It's got a threaded section on there, which means the cassette has to thread on, and it's also got some splines, not dissimilar to the HG cassette, but it is a little bit different. So we've got 2. Now we've got the kind of final iteration from Shimano. This is the Micro Spline one. So again, it's slightly stepped in, so it needs a different end cap on the far side of the drive side compared to the HG. The splines are quite a lot deeper. Again, there is one that's a different size or width than the others. And this one is for essentially just Shimano 12-speed. But with mountain bike standards as they are, I suspect there may be other standards coming. But essentially we've got those 3. So your bike will probably have one of those 3. Let's have a look at how you can find out which one you've got. Mini warning. As you might imagine, if we're switching out something integral to our drivetrain, we've got to be careful that we install it correctly, because if we don't, we might either have no drive, which means all of a sudden you'll try and pedal and your cranks will just spin round, or the unfortunate opposite, which is where you might have a fixed system on the back and you'll have no freewheel at all. So just be careful that when you reassemble, you're getting the parts in the right order. And depending on which you're switching from, if you're going from XD to Micro Spline, you might have different spaces inside that will change, and you'll definitely have different end caps. So just take time and just put it together properly. One last thing. I'd say the smallest, fiddliest parts of your bike are often on your Freehub, and that's the small paws and very small springs. And they've got a magical property of, as soon as you kind of slide them off the cassette, they tend to like pinging anywhere. I mean, they are springs, so they're going to do that. But they often kind of fire across the workshop and wedge themselves onto the heaviest item that you can't move. So just be careful. I've got a really good tip for solving that problem of small springs springing off, so stay tuned. Okay, the easiest way to have a look at what Freehub you're running is to take your cassette off, and actually it's probably the easiest way to replace it as well, is to take your cassette off. So personally I prefer the clampy tools over a chain whip. It's just personal preference, but if you clamp that in place or whip your chain whip around the cassette, we've got one of these nice single socket ones, but you might have a multi-piece. But get that all set up, offer up the cassette lock ring tool into the lock ring or into the cassette. And then set your hands at sort of 10 to 2. So sort of in a that format, and then you can just push down on both sides. It saves your hand slipping off or you gouging your knuckles like I've done there. For really stubborn cassettes, you can use a kind of like pinch technique where you set the tools up quite close and then you just pinch your hands together. It just saves any slipping or falling off the kind of tools. Next point is, if you've got an XD one, which you'll soon find out because it will sort of come off in one piece. If you've got a Shimano or other style cassette, it will most likely come off in stacks with sort of like cog, then some different spacers. So make sure you stack that up somewhere safe where you're not going to knock it over and lose the order of those spacers. I try and put a zip tie through it really quickly, and then it means that I don't have to use the kind of couple of brain cells that I've got to think about which order I need to lace them on when you go to put the cassette back on. We're going to start with the spring and pawl designs. These are all quite similar overall. Okay, somewhat different in detail, but essentially really similar in how they work. So on this Reynolds Ringlay Super Bubba, used to be Hubba Bub back in the day, I'm sure, hub, we've got a similar kind of disassembly as we've got with some of the other wheels in the range. So we're going to start by taking the end cap off. It should be fairly simple, so it's held in by an O-ring. So what's really nice about these Ringlay hubs is they've actually marked the end cap with XD or Micro Spline, but make sure that you put that to one side because effectively the spacing on that end is going to be different to the one that you'll need for Micro Spline. So keep them separate, otherwise you can cause all sorts of mishaps of things not fitting where they should fit. With the end cap removed, take the body of the Freehub in your hand and then slowly pull away. You might have to twist a little bit from the hub. As you pull the Freehub body off the axle, just be careful that sometimes the paws can stay inside the hub. So we don't want to lose those, so we'll tip the wheel back a little bit and make sure the hub's back. Just slowly slide it off. It should be a really nice tight fit. Doing it really slowly so I don't fire it across the workshop. Okay, there we go, it's come off. We've lost a few paws inside, but that's okay, we can use a magnet to pull those out. So put that next to the XD driver end cap. Okay, as I said, some of the paws have stayed in the hub. That's not a problem because we've got a little magnet here, this pick from Park, so we can pick out all the paws because you will need all of them. So on the FSA wheel that we just took the cassette off, we've got one of these on. This is a SRAM XD driver. This one's actually from a Ringlay hub, and we'll show you how that goes together and how you can switch them out. So you can see here it's got these little paws. You've got these soft springs here. These are a kind of a leaf spring style versus some of the conical style springs that you'll get under the paws in other systems. So the little springs are unsurprisingly very springy and sometimes they can be really fiddly. So if you find yourself a small plastic bag that you can get both hands into and the Freehub body, you can then happily work away at pushing the spring into place, grabbing a paw and sliding that into place, safe in the knowledge that if and when you drop it or the spring springs, it only fires into the plastic bag versus across the whole workshop or muddy field. So yeah, plastic bag, great top tip for switching paws. Now it's time to install the Micro Spline one. Often when you get a new Freehub body standard, you might get fresh paws and fresh springs with it. Might not be assembled. With some brands, you might have to actually transfer the paws and springs that you've got. With the paws switched over, now it's time to replace the Freehub itself with the Micro Spline that we're using here. Make sure you put the spacers in that are relevant. Often for the different Freehub standards, so whether it be Micro Spline or XD, you might have to put in a different spacer. So just make sure you've got the right one. I know this from sort of personal experience where I might have not put the order in quite correctly. And yeah, it wasn't perfect, so sorry Neil about that. So slide the spacer on. Now with all the paws in place, we will carefully slide the Freehub body on. Now with a push and a twist, these should engage just in one go. Fingers crossed. Just like that. Next, you'll need the dedicated end cap. So this one's the Micro Spline one. Helpfully Reynolds actually mark the end cap with Micro Spline, but make sure that you're fitting the correct one because the XD and Micro Spline end caps will be different. So again, this is just a push fit, so it should just pop on. Right. This wheel is all set for a Micro Spline cassette. So with all the Freehub systems that we've seen today, although they've got subtly different setups, whether it be some spacers, and the paws and springs have been different, essentially they've all been the same, which is that kind of clutch assembly, or Freehub, and Ratchet, has been perpendicular to the axle. The DT Swiss wheel I've got here, I mean, they've been doing it for quite a while. They've been doing it pre-V brakes. They've been doing it since '94. And their Star Ratchet system, there's a couple of different iterations of it, works in line with the axle. So it does look quite different. And hopefully we'll be able to disassemble this and show you how it's different. So again, we're going to pop the end cap off, just like that. We're then going to slide the freehub body off, and immediately you can see that this one is the Ratchet EXP version. So opposed to using two springs and two spring-loaded ratchets, it's just got one system inside and a spacer. So there's the assembly. Essentially, it works in a really similar way in that this piece is replaceable, and it's got a spring. It's just all sort of like in a different format. They do lots of different iterations, so just be mindful if you've got one that says Ratchet XP, I think there's a Ratchet LN. They are subtly different. So some of them are compatible and some of them are not compatible. So just make sure that you check the DT Swiss website to know which works. But they do Micro Spline, they do a HG, and they do an XD as well. So you're pretty well covered. Reassembling it, it's fairly simple in terms of making sure the ratchet and spring are in place, making sure that the spacer is in, and then sliding that freehub body on, and it all should just clip together. Then you've got your end cap that holds everything together, just push on. With FSA, with the gradient specifically here, we've got a few different iterations of how you change the freehub. Essentially, we've got a similar layout to some of the other wheels where we've got end caps either end. We've got a ratchet system with paws and springs on the inside, but to get into them is a little bit more engaging. So first step, we're going to take non-drive side cap off. We're then going to get a 2.5mm Allen key. This is actually the bearing preload system. It's quite a clever system whereby you can actually sort of set the tension on the axle and the bearings, so you can make the wheels spin really, really quickly. So then we're going to thread that off very slowly. Then we're going to switch the wheel around and then just push the axle and assembly out. A little bit of stiffness here because we've got to slide it through the bearing on the non-drive side, just like that. And then you've got a sub-assembly here with your freehub on it. So the next steps to changing it would be taking this end cap off here. So there's I think it's a 19mm or maybe 20mm flat just here on the axle, and then you unscrew this side, and then you can remove the freehub body and slide it back on. So once that's all slotted back together again, we flip round to the non-drive side. We're going to check that that bearing washer is sat nicely still. It is. We're then going to reinstall the preload bearing collar, and it's a tricky one just to set up, but if you just do it sort of finger tight, you can actually feel when there's just a nice amount of resistance in the bearings. Too loose and you'll feel sort of a little bit of slop in the wheel. Too tight and you won't get the best rolling resistance or form. So again, tighten that up, not too tight, just 2 Newton meters, and then you can just plug in the end cap. Okay, so we've shown you how to change, or at least look at all the different freehub standards on a good range of wheels. Now, whilst you've got the cassette off and you've got the kind of guts of the freehub open, so you've got the end cap off, you might be tempted to be like, well, that's a spinning bit. We've got bearings in there. I know what bearings like, and that's grease. And you're not wrong, but just be really mindful about where you're putting that grease. If you've got time and the kind of like inclination, you can pop the seals on those bearings inside, and just, if they're in an okay shape, so they're not too crusty already, you can add a bit more grease. But be really mindful about when you're installing more grease, not to put too much grease on the paws and springs, because essentially you need those to move really freely. The other problem is that what can often happen is if the springs are too gummed up, they just won't engage, and they'll kind of slip and slide around, which is less than ideal. Another issue that you can get is, unfortunately, like here, we've added a bit too much grease into this drive ring here, and opposed to the paws and springs staying with the freehub body, they've wanted to stay with the hub body. So that means as we've tried to change it, that grease is stuck together and it's made it all a bit gummy. So just choose which greases you're going to use inside your hubs really carefully. To be fair, most manufacturers have different recommendations. So I know that with some brands, they actually prefer you to use a light oil versus a grease. Just because it's so light, they need it to not be heavy so that the springs can do their work. But now you've got it all apart, put it all back together again. install that cassette carefully. Again, if you're wanting to do a really good job, I would recommend putting some grease on the splines and on the threads. And that applies both to the Micro Spline and to the XD bodies, or even the HG bodies. So just spreading a little bit of grease on these splines will mean that if you're putting a steel cassette on, there'll be no bimetallic corrosion. You won't get stuff stuck if you leave it a little bit too long. But remember to keep the thick grease away from those pores. Reassembly, tighten everything up to the manufacturer's standards, and yeah, put the back wheel in and go enjoy riding.